Today we're going to try something a little different from the country talks. I thought it would be really cool to learn something about science, and I thought a really good way to start with science would be to ask the question, where did people come from? How did people end up being in this world? And really the best way to answer that question is to talk about something called evolution. Now, what evolution means, evolution is a word that really means like a gradual process of change in general. But the word evolution is usually used to describe the way that life on Earth has changed over time. We know that life started extremely simple, just with organisms that were just one cell, and over time things changed, and now we have this incredible variety of plants, fungi, animals of all kinds of descriptions that have become much more complicated. And even though life started in the oceans, there's now life on land, in the air. Life has expanded to fill almost every single place on the earth. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how that happened and really what evolution means. So in order to understand evolution, you have to understand that really three different principles that make evolution possible. Now, the first of those evolutions is something called variation. That just means that the offspring, in other words, like the babies of an organism, are not going to be exactly the same as the parent or the parents. And nothing can change if everything just stays exactly the same from generation to generation. So things have to change. And there are two ways generally that variation happens. One is that when you have two parents, each parent has one book of instructions. So the two books of instructions are combined to make each baby. So each baby has pieces from the daddy's book of instructions and pieces from the mommy's book of instructions. But if daddy and mommy have 1,000 babies or 10,000 babies, no two babies will be the same, because even though each baby takes instructions from the daddy's book and from the mommy's book, none of those babies will have exactly the same organization, the exact same parts from daddy and the exact same parts from mommy.
But what if they're twins?
If they're identical twins, then they will be very close. But we know that's very rare. That's not how life generally goes with identical twins. So we can not worry about identical twins, and we can worry about like the other 999 out of 1,000 babies. The other way that variation happens is from mutation. Now you remember that all the books of instructions are written in a language that has 4 letters, right? That paper that the instructions are written in is called DNA. Long strings that are written just in chains of those 4 letters, C, A, T, and G. C, T, T, C, A, G, G, C, T. That language is made up of just 4 letters. And what happens is sometimes when those books of instructions are being copied to make a new baby, well, not sometimes, but every time, some mistakes get made. An A gets put in instead of a C. A G gets put in instead of a T. And sometimes those changes have no effect at all. Sometimes they're really bad and they mean the baby can't develop at all or the baby dies. And sometimes they help the baby a little bit. But it's no one's planning that. It's just pure chance that happens. And the other thing that happens is that once all the babies are born, some organisms can have dozens or hundreds of babies, right? They have lots of extras. And once those babies are born, not all of them are going to make it and grow up, right? Because some of them are going to get eaten, Some of them are going to starve. There's not enough food. So out of all those hundreds of babies that are just a little bit different and a little bit different in some tiny way, some of those babies, because of the differences that they have, are more likely to be able to get the food, and they're more likely to be able to run away from whatever's trying to eat them. Those babies are going to survive and have their own babies. The ones that aren't as good are not going to make it. That is called natural selection. So now we have variation, that's principle 1. We have natural selection, that's principle 2. The last one is called hereditability. And all that means is that if there's a change in your book of instructions, a mutation that helps you, and you survive, you're going to pass that on to your baby. So that mutation is going to become selected for. That all the babies are going to end up having that mutation that helps them live longer. So if you happen to be an animal with claws, if something happens, a little mutation that causes your claws to be a little bit sharper than your brothers and sisters' claws, then when something tries to eat you, you can scratch it a little bit deeper and make it give up and go after your brother or sister instead. Your instructions with the sharp claws are going to be the ones that get passed on to the next generation. And eventually, none of the animals with the short claws are going to be around anymore. They're going to die out. They'll all be eaten. It'll only be the animals with the sharp claws. When one kind of animal dies out and it's not around any longer because it's not best suited for the environment that it's in, it's called going extinct. There are no more of them anymore. So let's watch one
What
quick...
if they leave their babies behind? Does that mean they're not extinct?
If you leave your baby, if you have more babies, then you're not extinct. But eventually, once the baby changes, the claws get sharper, the teeth get bigger, whatever it is, eventually there are so many changes that the original animal doesn't really exist anymore. And when that animal doesn't exist anymore, it's extinct because its babies evolved, and it's now a completely different animal. So let's just look a little bit at this video so we can see how evolution works.
What is evolution? Evolution is the development of life on Earth. This is a process that began billions of years ago and is still continuing to this day. Evolution tells us how it was possible for the enormous diversity of life to develop. It shows us how primitive protozoa could become the millions of different species that we see today. The first question to ask is therefore, how can one animal develop into a whole new species of animal? But just a quick question. What exactly is a species? A species is a community of animals that is capable of producing offspring with one another, with those offspring also being capable of reproducing in turn. To understand this answer better, we need to take a closer look at the following points. The uniqueness of living creatures, guaranteed through the excess production of offspring and heredity. And, as a second key point, selection. Let's begin with uniqueness. Every creature that exists is unique, and this is essential for evolution. The members of a species may strongly resemble each other in appearance, however, they all have slightly different traits and characteristics. They may be a bit bigger, fatter, stronger, or bolder than their fellow animals. But how is the enormous range of DNA created? One key factor is the excess production of offspring. In nature, we can observe that creatures generally produce far more offspring than is necessary for the survival of their species, with many offspring dying an early death as a result. Often there are even more offspring than the environment in which they live is able to support. This is one factor in increasing diversity within a species. The more offspring that are produced, the more little differences occur. And this is what nature wants, as many little differences as possible. The second major cause of the uniqueness of individuals occurs in heredity itself. By the way, heredity means the passing on of DNA to offspring. Two very interesting factors come into play in this process: recombination and mutation. Recombination is the random mixing of the DNA of two creatures. When two creatures fall in love and mate, they recombine their genes twice. The first time they do this separately, when they generate the gametes, that is, sperm and egg cells. The gametes take half of the genes and shuffle them. The parents each provide 50% of their DNA, in other words, 50% of their unique traits and characteristics. These are then recombined or mixed, and the result is new offspring. These offspring have a random mix of the DNA and therefore the traits and characteristics of their parents. This increases the diversity and differences within a species even further. But mutations are also important for evolution. Mutations are random changes in DNA. These can also be described as copying errors within the DNA, triggered by toxins or other chemical substances or by radiation. A mutation exists when a part of the DNA is altered. These changes are often negative and may result in illnesses such as cancer. However, they may also have neutral or positive effects. In the heredity process, creatures pass on their characteristics to their offspring in the form of DNA. Recombination and mutation change the DNA so that each child looks different to its siblings and receives a random mix of the characteristics of its parents. Each individual is subjected to a process of natural selection. As we have learned, each individual is somewhat different to its fellows, and there is extensive variation within a species. Environmental influences have an effect on living creatures. These so-called selection factors include predators, parasites, animals of the same species, toxins, changes in habitat, or the climate. Selection is a process that each individual is subjected to. Every creature has a unique mix of traits and characteristics. This mix helps them to survive in their environment, or not, as the case may be. Anyone with an unsuitable mix will be selected from the environment. Those with the right mix survive and can pass on their enhanced traits and characteristics.
So there's a couple of things that are important to understand. You have to understand that evolution is an incredibly slow process, because if you think about it, all these things happening by chance, what is the chance of something happening that's really going to be a benefit to the organism? It's rare that it happens. And when you think about all the things that had to happen for humans to come from single cells in the ocean, they had to get lungs, they had to come out of the water, they had to get arms, they had to get legs, they had to get big brains. It took millions and millions and millions of years. So it took a long time for people to understand this was happening, because this is not something that anybody can see. Even in animals like mice that reproduce quickly, that you can see through many generations, it's way, way, way too slow. Even if you look through 100 generations of animals, you're not going to see evolution happening. Now, we can see something like evolution when we do something called artificial selection or breeding, right? That's how different dogs look so different, because people specifically pick out the dogs that have the variations they want, and they breed them together. So if they have a bunch of dogs, they take the two biggest ones, they take the two littlest ones, they make the two biggest ones a daddy and mommy, they make the two littlest ones a daddy and mommy. You keep doing that for a few generations, and pretty soon you have big dogs and you have little dogs. You have two different kinds of dogs. But that doesn't happen by chance in the real world. That's humans putting their artificial breeding techniques. So then you can see much faster how animals change, because you get these different kinds of dogs that look so completely different. But in the natural world, it happens very slowly and gradually. Eventually, in about the 18th century, is when they realized that evolution was happening. The main thing that helped them understand that evolution was happening was that was when they first started discovering fossils. Do you remember what fossils are? Ian, what are fossils?
Fossils are bones that are buried in ground like dinosaurs.
Right, they're the bones that have turned into stone, actually, of animals that lived millions of years ago. And when they found these bones, they realized that these animals in some ways were like the animals that we have today, but these animals were nowhere on Earth. They must have existed in the past, but they didn't exist any longer. And from that, people quickly figured out that animals had changed over time. They used to be one way, and now the animals that walk the earth look really different. The question was, how did that change occur? And there were two real theories by two different scientists. One of those scientists was named Lamarck. The other one was named Darwin. Lamarck believed that animals changed because they adapted, and it was kind of like an active process. So imagine there's a bunch of animals that are in the grassland, and there's a bunch of trees that have, the leaves, and the animals eat the leaves off the trees. Now the animals, their heads only go this high, right? So all the animals eat all the leaves that are up to here, right? And then if they can't reach any higher. There's all these leaves that are higher. The animals start to starve. So the animal starts to stretch to try and reach the higher leaves. And eventually it can reach some of them and reach some of them. That animal that can stretch and reach the leaves, something changes in its instructions because it was stretching. And then when it has a baby, the animal that stretched its neck to reach the leaves has a baby with a longer neck. Darwin disagreed with that. He felt like animals would get longer necks over time to reach those trees, but it wasn't because their parents were stretching. It was random chance. That just by pure chance, something would change in the instructions. One animal would be born with a longer neck. That animal would be more likely to survive because he could reach that taller leaves. And when he survived and the other one starved, the animal with the longer neck would pass on his genes to his baby, but it wasn't because he stretched. It was just chance that he was born with a longer neck and he would pass it on. And that's why in Africa, you have some animals like deer and antelopes that have regular sized necks, and then you have what animal with a really long neck?
Like a giraffe.
A giraffe, right? That's where the giraffe came from. By random chance, animals were born with bigger necks. Those ones survived to occupy that niche, that space that existed for an animal that could eat those high leaves that the other animals couldn't. Eventually, we found out that Darwin was right and Lamarck was wrong. It was random variation that led to evolution.
But was Darwin mad?
Darwin. Lamarck was the other. I don't know. I never had a chance to ask him. But the famous voyage that Charles Darwin took to find out, to prove that his theory of evolution was correct, was called the Voyage of the Beagle. The Beagle was a boat that went to islands off the coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands that were isolated from the mainland. He studied little birds called finches, and he was basically able to look at all the different finches and figure out how the finches had changed over time to make different niches. They all started from the same kind of bird, and over millions of years, they changed. And some finches grew long beaks in order to pick worms out of the ground. Other finches grew different kinds of beaks to pick bugs out of the bark of trees.
Are finches birds?
Finches are birds.
How about their legs?
And their wings were different. And, it's a little bit beyond what I can talk about right now, but you can study and see exactly how Darwin proved his theory of evolution just by studying these finches. So, of course, the most interesting for us part is, where did humans come from, right? So we know that we started as single cells. Single cells eventually became little tiny organisms you still couldn't see, but multiple cells. Then things like tadpoles, then fish, then things that were kind of like salamanders or newts that crawled onto land, then like little mice first, then bigger rodents, small mammals, then monkeys. So we're going to see how humans evolved from the beginning. The simplest monkeys are like lemurs, tarsiers. Apes came later. Apes are closer to us. Look, we're going to go down the ape branch. Now something very important is about to happen. We stand. Ardipithecus was the first standing primate. Then Australopithecus had a bigger brain. Okay, so do you kind of get an understanding of what happened over millions of years?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so it's important to understand these very important ancestors, okay? So about 10 million years ago was the first Ardipithecus. That was the main thing that changed, that allowed us to become human. A monkey started walking on two legs. And once monkeys were walking, that kind of changed everything about where they were able to go. They didn't need to be confined to the trees anymore. the brain started to grow, because once you were on the ground, you needed to learn to avoid predators. You needed to learn how to hunt. Humans, or hominids, did not have big teeth, big claws. They did not have things to kill. They needed to develop big brains so they could learn to make weapons. They could learn to make shelter and clothing.
And they can learn to make a hammer.
Right.
They use wood and stone.
Well, yeah. So this was also, Ardipithecus walked 10 million years ago. 4 million years ago, Australopithecus, and he had the big brain. Then came the first cousins of us, not really humans, but Homo habilis, Homo erectus. Okay, they were using tools 2.5 million years ago. Then things started to branch out. One branch was called the Neanderthals. They were almost like humans. They were like our cousins. On the other side, you had Homo erectus. They're the ones. But humans and Neanderthals actually lived at the same time and may have mixed together somewhat. But Neanderthals died out. They were not as good as Homo erectus, and Homo erectus became Homo sapiens. That is what we are. Homo means man, sapiens means wise. Homo is our genius, sapiens is our species. So right now, what we are now is Homo sapiens. We're gonna watch one more video about humans.
Its origin dates back 20 million years to those fruit-eating creatures that lived in African trees called proconsuls. They romped about in trees, far above terrestrial dangers, feeding on fruit and leaves. Depending on the species, they varied in size from the marmoset to the gorilla. They hardly cared about the world below. Proconsuls climbed about the branches on all fours and almost exactly resembled the modern-day macaque. Their upper and lower limbs were the same size. They moved leaning on open palms instead of bended fingers. Quite a few fossils of proconsuls have been found in East Africa. The skull was primitive, the brain small and rather simple, yet the comparatively small size of their muzzle and canine teeth suggests non-aggressiveness, one of the major features that led to reason. But 10 million years ago, a drop in temperature made the African jungle sparse, which rendered it impossible to move from tree to tree via branches. Forced to leave the trees, the descendant of proconsul, Ardipithecus, began moving on their rear limbs. Their feet were still prehensile, but with special arches that allowed bipedalism. The nearly complete skeleton of an Ardipithecus named Ardi proves that these creatures were able to walk, albeit not as easily as we do. The arms of Ardipithecus were knee-length, and the hands were half human and half ape-like. The first steps were taken to climb the next tree. Ardipithecus didn't want to leave tree crowns, their habitual homes. They were indeed the intermediate between humans and apes, as all of Ardi's features mediate entirely ape-like and entirely human features. But life moved on. Trees became sparse, and Africa turned into a boundless savanna. 4 million years ago, new creatures paced in the savanna, gracile australopiths. They were well adjusted to their new home. Their way of walking on two legs was not so different from ours. They gathered and ate everything, and were able to walk miles on end. They formed cohesive groups, which allowed them to repel any danger. Moreover, they were curious. Their skull was still ape-like, with an obtrusive muzzle and receding forehead. At first glance, it is hard to detect our features, but the head was held on the upright neck, the canine teeth got smaller, and the brain bigger. 3 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis of East Africa evolved into the first humans. 2.5 million years ago, our ancestors crossed the Rubicon of brain size, 700 grams. The first representative of our genus, Homo habilis, handyman. He got his name for a reason. It was Homo habilis who was the first to make stone tools. These primitive choppers made from pebble with a few blows were still real tools for carving meat, whittling wood, defending from predators, and killing prey. Man was now armed. Life in the trees was left for good, and the savanna promoted forward movement. Perhaps our love for travel and exploration dates back to those times. The world was perilous, but intelligence made it possible to overcome difficulties. It was not power or aggression, but intelligence that protected the first humans. The skull of Homo habilis is very much like that of Australopithecus, yet the brain size was 600 to 800 grams now, 1.5 times as much as its predecessors. The face became smaller. Around 1.5 million years ago, a new species appeared, Homo ergaster, working man. They became the terror of the African savanna. Spears and stone tools were an unprecedented phenomenon. Even the fiercest animals weren't safe from harm now. Man became a hunter. Skeletons of antelopes and even elephants surrounded by stone tools have been found in East Africa. Cut marks on animal bones are visible evidence of a new stage of our evolution. Possibly, this is around the same time humans first discovered fire, albeit the evidence of that is rare and unreliable. Quite a few fossils of the first humans have remained in East Africa. The ape-like legacy in the skull was now in the past, but their jaws were still large and their brains twice as small as ours. Their height and build were exactly like that of modern humans. Their bodies, except for their heads, were hardly any different from ours. They settled all over Africa and were the first to move beyond. The last step was to colonize the planet, so they took that step, and the vast expanses of the planet were conquered.
All right, so you guys understand the important principles of evolution, right? Variation, that no baby is exactly like their parents. There are changes because of combinations of the two parents. There are changes because of mutations. And over time, babies that have mutations that are good, that are helpful, are the ones that will live and reproduce and have more babies. That is called survival of the fittest, natural selection. When they have babies, their instructions will get passed on to their babies. So their babies will have the same advantages of the parents, and eventually one of them will get a new advantage, and that so on and so on and so on. It's very, very slow, but it's still happening. We are still evolving, and in 1 million years, if humans are still around in 1 million years, we will look very different from the way that we look now. But we can't predict exactly how that will happen. Nobody can predict evolution. We can only go back and look and learn and see what happened before from fossils. And that basically teaches us about the whole process. But it explains how we came from the simplest block of life, just a little piece of instructions with a little oil drop around it. That was the earliest form of life, and over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, here we are today. And remember Charles Darwin, one of the most famous scientists who ever lived, because he was the first to describe the theory of evolution on the voyage of the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands. You guys have any other questions?
No.
Yeah.
What?
I don't get it. Why do they call it? Why do they say that he's very famous? Because like, how do you know about this?
Charles Darwin, he figured it out. He figured it out.
It's because he found one of
He
these
found
fossils.
he knew from what the scientists who came before him. I don't believe he actually studied fossils himself, but he knew about fossil science. He read about it, and then when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he studied the birds, he studied the finches, and that was the other piece of the puzzle that they didn't have from the fossils. He studied the different types, and he worked backwards and figured out how those finches had changed to occupy the different niches. Niches mean the different spots, the different places where there was food and a chance for survival. That's what he figured out, and that's how he demonstrated his theory of evolution.
Yeah, but were there books at his time?
Of course there were books at his time. The printing press had already been invented 200 years before that. So
Yeah,
there were
because
lots of books around.
After Leonardo
His,
died.
his book that he wrote that you can still buy and read was called The Origin of Species. It's one of the most famous scientific books ever written. It was 300 years after Leonardo da Vinci. Okay guys, that's all we have time for. I know you have other stuff you want to do tonight. So
Bye.
that's the theory of evolution. Bye-bye.